All right, 357 Productions is proud to present an interview with Josef Wages. This is part of our Darkness to Light series. Riley's not here today. He was otherwise committed. Brother Josef Wages comes to us all the way from Plano, Texas. Plano Lodge number 768. You don't have much of a Texas accent, Joe.
Sorry.
That's okay. We won't hold it against you. Chuck Dunning was here, and Chuck has this nice Texas twang. I don't know what part of the state he's from, but you could about tell where he's from. But you're an anomaly, I guess, that the universe spit out, huh?
I think so.
in more ways than one, right?
Just a few.
So Joe's here for, like usual, most of our guest speakers. He's here to speak to Sophia. We're going to be doing that later today. We got in pretty late last night, set up, solved the world's problems with a friend or two. And got up and had a leisurely breakfast here at the Tractor Shed Cafe, and now we're ready to roll into this interview. The reason that Joe's going to come talk to us is he is the editor of a book called The Secret School of Wisdom, available at Amazon.
Hey.
Yes?
That's right.
And everybody should go have a copy of this.
Or two.
Yeah, you can fade that on down. So, so Amazon, go to Amazon, buy Joe's book. Joe, tell us all about it. How'd this come about?
Well, we kind of worked from about 2010 forward. I kind of got the idea that, no one's really even seen the entire Illuminati ritual system. So I was working with my buddy Reinhard out of Berlin.
The Illuminati?
Yeah, the Illuminati.
You mean like the one that Lady Gaga was just saying has ruined her life because she sold her soul to the Illuminati?
That's right. She had to put her demit in. It was a very sad day for the hip-hop Illuminati.
Yeah, so for the wingnuts that are going to take that seriously, different crowd, right?
That's right.
Okay. Completely, absolutely zero, no ties to this thing that's called the Illuminati today.
That's right. The idea of the Illuminati today is, they have all the hip hop people that are into that stuff, but you also get various conspiracy groups, and a lot of it comes from, the Illuminati themselves. They only lasted from about 1776 to 1788. And then after that, the Bavarian government starts publishing things against them to kind of persecute them. And what ends up happening is they just kind of go by the wayside. But the thing is that they had a lot of their rituals and a lot of their personal correspondence published to shame them. And so their legacy kind of serves as a template for other groups to kind of copy off of. And so you get a lot of different groups recycling that name Illuminati. And even in their rituals, they say the Illuminati, they said the first Christians, after, receiving their baptism, that they were considered illuminated, and that was the context of it. And, there were groups there were before the Bavarian Illuminati, the Alumbrados in Spain and the Illuminés of Avignon. But so it's not a new or original name or idea, but the conspiracy group that people were referencing is that Bavarian Illuminati. So that was kind of a long-winded answer, wasn't it?
No, that's okay. I think the key is we want to make sure that...
Yes, there's a distinction.
We know that it's different, but I just want to make sure that everybody understands that the crap that they have going on today is not even...
It's just that.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. All right, so tell us about the book. How did you come to be involved with it?
So we got the idea back in 2010 that we're going to go ahead and take all these rituals. A lot of the rituals are in this thing called the Schwedenkiste, which was...
Schwedenkiste,
yeah. And so they take this, the Swedish chest. It contained all of the papers of Johann Christoph von Bode. And Bode kind of took over the Illuminati after Weishaupt. And ironically, Weishaupt gets kicked out of the very club that he starts.
It always happens that way, right?
That's right. No respect for the founder, no respect. And so Bode runs with it for a while, and then when he dies in 1793, all of his papers, which included a lot of the correspondence, there's 20 volumes. Each volume's about 1,000 pages long. So you're talking about 20,000 pages of archival material. And the Schwedenkiste Volume 8 is the rituals. And so we took all the rituals, and for some degrees, there's multiple copies of them. And for others, the top 2 degrees, the Philosophy degree, there's only one copy of it that exists in the world. And so from 2010 to 2014 was transcribing all these rituals, translating all these rituals. And then from 14 to 15, we kind of edited the whole thing down and put the whole system back together. And it's never been reconstructed before in any language, let alone German. And so now we've got an English copy. We have a new French translation that came out last year. and ironically, the German version's the last.
You're going to get around to the German. So you keep saying we. Tell us about the people that wrote this with you.
Yeah, so Reinhard Marker is one of the leading Masonic scholars in Germany. Jiva passed away a few years ago. He was a good friend of mine. He was from Frankfurt, so he translated the whole thing. We just all kind of worked together, and it was kind of maddening because like the amount of like detail that's in this stuff and just how technical this book is. It was one of the hardest things I think I've ever done, to be honest.
Really? So the Bavarian Illuminati, I assume, is from Bavaria.
That's right.
Where is this?
Yeah, so Ingolstadt University, 1776, Weishaupt founds it. What's interesting is...
It's in Germany today, right?
In Germany, yeah. That's right. And so what's interesting is Weishaupt, he has an earlier sketch that he's kind of got the idea to start a secret society from Christoph Ernst Henninger, was a student of his, and they would talk about secret societies. And so like the first draft for the Illuminati in it was 74, 75, but he wrote this thing called the School for Humanity. And so it kind of resembles the Illuminati later on. So he's kind of like, writing down some of the ideas of what he wants to build in a secret society. And it's, some little fragmentary sketch, but Reinhard did that a few years back. It was real interesting.
So all this was written in the 18th century, and you guys found it where and when?
Well, these things have been in that Schwedenkiste we talked about. So the Swedish chest, after Boda dies, it goes and it is sent up to Sweden, and then in the 1880s, the Germans ask for it back.
So this is just one copy of many, probably, that went somewhere, or is this the?
Well, there's like fragmentary pieces. The trouble is, like when the Nazis came to power, they suppressed Freemasonry and kind of scooped up not just German Masonic papers, but all the papers of continental Europe for the most part, and so all these things were scooped up by them. Then at the end of the war, the Soviets come in and they capture all these archives, and they hold most of these until like the collapse of the Soviet Union. Most of the stuff's come back. There's still, like in Minsk, there's a few things that are still there.
Let's circle back to all that, because I want to do a whole 15-minute block on World War II and what happened to all of our archives. But
okay. This
manuscript
collection
wound up in Sweden, and that's where you guys found it.
Well, no, it was in Sweden, and in the 1880s, the Germans asked for it back, and then they got these papers back, or they thought they got everything back. There's still little fragments that are in their archives up there, like Boda's whole book collection's there. He's got a whole thing of ciphers. Some of his personal manuscripts are there. But for the most part, they got everything back. And it wasn't that they weren't trying to give it back. It's like the Swedish archivist probably thought, oh, these things are always going to be here. So they started kind of mixing them into their archive. And so in the 1880s, they send it back to Germany. And then, Hitler comes to power. It's captured. And so these materials, they didn't really get them back until like 91 or 93. And so that's why there hasn't really been a lot of research on this, because it was pretty much unavailable along with all these other Masonic records.
So these guys found it, that you were just telling me, the authors.
Yeah, so
and then how'd they get up with you?
Well, so Reinhard was working with Hermann Schuttler and a couple other people.
Keep going.
And, okay. So he's working with these different people. And the Germans have been doing this research since then. And I've been following Reinhard's work for a long time. And, just through like kind of corresponding with Reinhard, I started making discoveries and stuff too. And then so the next thing you know, I was like, well, let's do the whole ritual book. And he's like, oh, that's an okay idea. Well, I just kind of took off and started doing it. And then when he saw how far I'd got, he's like, okay, we're going to make some changes here. I'll be a co-editor with you, and we're going to get this book out. So it's a book that just kind of came out because I just kind of took it on myself and just ran with it.
Yeah, that's awesome, because so many times people think, oh, this is too big a task to tackle, or the powers that be will never let this happen, or it's too much work, or whatever. But if you have the vision, you can create some pretty cool stuff, huh?
It also helps not sleeping very much. So like the the wife and kids, like they'll go to bed around like 10 o'clock, and I worked on it from like 10 to 3 in the morning, every day, no breaks, no days off, and did it for like 5 years. So that also helped a little bit, but it's just determination, right? So like any large and worthy like goal that you try and set out for yourself, you'll break it into small bite-sized little pieces, because if you looked at it like in totality, it seems like it's an impossible task. But if you break it down to small little movable pieces that you can make, gradual, progressive, incremental progress, I mean, that's how you get things done.
Right on, brother. Amen. All right, so tell us about this Illuminati. Who were they, and what did they believe, and how did they get in trouble?
Well, they kind of started out more like a academic fraternity, like a Phi Beta Kappa, something like this. And Weishaupt, he's got this idea that he wants to form this secret society to kind of change the world. And what they're not talking about like overthrowing governments or anything like that. Kind of the background is in the 18th century they have this thing called Enlightened Absolutism. I kind of like to call it Enlightened Despotism, kind of like by royal edict. You will be educated, you will be free, that kind of stuff. And so
Enlightened Despotism, that's nuts.
That's what I like to call it. But so anyways, like they start putting all these reforms in Bavaria at this point. So it's not Germany, it's the Holy Roman Empire, but it's in decay, and like you have all the Protestant states in the north, Catholic states in the south. They all have different governmental systems, but they all loosely agree to kind of defend each other in war and so forth. And so all these changes are happening. Maximilian III was the elector of Bavaria, and when he died, it goes on. Sorry, no, he was the Duke of Bavaria. But then when he died, it went to the Elector Karl Theodor. So he would brought in a lot of these reforms in the Enlightenment for education, and then his successor, Karl Theodor, throttled all that stuff back and then started doing censorship and that sort of thing. And the Jesuits had been disbanded in 73, and so Weishaupt's the first non-Jesuit to become a professor of canon law. And the Jesuits don't like that because they still work there. They're just not formally Jesuits. So they kind of cut off his paychecks, and he doesn't really like that very much. So he creates the secret society as a way to kind of, put the whole Enlightenment education type thing back on track. So it's really like an honors academic fraternity, and the things that they're studying are like popular philosophy, science, the whole scientific method. The first elector, he had the Bavarian Academy of Sciences put in and that kind of thing. And so what he's basically trying to do is bring in the Enlightenment, and even though it's no longer possible to do it publicly, so that's why it's a secret school of wisdom.
And this is in the Catholic part or the Protestant part of?
In the Catholic part.
In the Catholic part.
Mm-hmm.
That's very interesting. All right, so they start putting together the society, a bunch of secret brothers meeting in secret,
Mm-hmm.
trying not to get their head in a vice. Right, literally and figuratively.
Right, yeah.
I assume there are other secret societies kicking around at the same time. I assume there's a lot of cross-pollination, as there usually is.
Absolutely. And so, like, if you think about it, if a secret society started by a college professor, don't really have a lot of cash, and he's relying on this kind of stuff. So about 1778, they get the idea, hey, let's merge with Freemasonry. That's a good place to get members, and also we could maybe steer some of the money towards our ends. And that was the thinking. But the trouble is Adam Weishaupt only made it to like the second degree in Freemasonry. His was a strict observance lodge, and that's the group that was observing the whole Templar legend and so forth. Total bunk. But
well, wait, we're going to circle back to that one in a minute too.
Okay.
Okay, we're coming back to the rite of strict observance later. All right. So, but in the meantime, cross-pollinating between these different secret societies or semi-secret societies. And so how did it rise? And then talk about how it started to fall. And by the way, isn't this awful late for the Enlightenment to be coming to Germany? I mean, it was that's almost 100 years behind England. And
so England really gets going like in the late 1690s, and it takes a while. It just takes a while. That's what it is. And
the Royal Society was in the 1670s, right? But right after Charles II came back from
Sure,
exile.
But if you think about like all the different wars and things that are happening in continental Europe, so it's the conclusion of all these like the 7 Years' Wars and so forth, the War of Austrian Succession, that it allows for like this enlightened despotism. And so like a lot of the things that happened in the French Revolution, the things that caused it, the Germans circumvented it through like agrarian land reforms, like dispersing public lands, abolishing serfdom, and that kind of thing. And so it took a while, but it was a reform that was necessary. And it really did bring in the Enlightenment, but they just got a late start at it.
That's cool. Okay, so they're putting it all together. How popular does it get?
Well, it starts off very slow, very gradual. From 76 to 78, they've only got like 10 members. I mean, these guys here, and then so they get their first little lodge set up, St. Theodore Good Counsel, and they kind of start spreading the system around. But it's real slow growth until about 1780. Then this guy, Knigge, joins up the order, and he's a former member of the Strict Observance, and he becomes like a rock star. So the Strict Observance is like in terminal decline at this point after the death of their founder, Baron von Hund. And so there's, you look at it, and there's like many groups that kind of splinter off of what was the Strict Observance, and they create their own little parallel reforms to it. So Knigge wants to do his little reform, and he meets the Marquis de Costanzo, and he's like, well, hey, don't do that. We got the society you're looking for right here, brother. Just come on down.
This is the droid you're looking for.
These are the droids you are looking for. That's right.
And so they breathe life into it, and it grows.
Yeah, so he's a rock star. He starts recruiting like crazy, but the trouble is Weishaupt hasn't finished the system. So Weishaupt is really good at writing lectures. He's a professor. He likes talking, kind of like me.
Kind of like you.
Kind of like me. But on the other hand, he's not very good at writing ritual. He's only a fellow craft, so he's got some context, but not a proper context. But Kniga, on the other hand, is a high-ranking member of the strict observance. And so what you see is he builds all the ritual work, Weishaupt writes all the lectures, but they have like two competing visions. So Weishaupt wants a secret school of wisdom, Kniga wants his Masonic high degree system, they lock heads. Kniga demits in 84, and by that point, I think all in all, there's maybe 1,900 members. There's 1,600 some odd that we know of. We don't have a total complete picture of all of it, but we've got a pretty good idea of who are all members. And so, you see dispersion all the way throughout Europe. The main concentration is in Germany, what's today Austria. There's some Eastern European places, like in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, places like that. Some Italian lodges, and very few French lodges, mainly in I can't think of it, like around Strasbourg. And it'll come to me in a minute.
So they
Alsatian region. That's
so
what it is.
so they had lodges in those areas at that time.
Yeah, and
they're not there now.
No.
It's completely suppressed now.
It died, but what's interesting is if you look at the Illuminati's craft degrees, and you compare it to this thing called the what am I thinking of? The eclectic rite. It hasn't been conclusively proven, but I'm fairly certain that the Illuminati's craft degrees are the eclectic rite, or what become the eclectic rite, and it runs on until 1933. But it's not within an Illuminati context. It's just like a little branch. And it's what the eclectic rite was is we have 3 symbolic degrees, but any high degrees, the lodge is at liberty to choose, which actually works really nice for the Illuminati. It's like wink, wink, nudge, nudge. All the officers are members of our system. So you get to choose which high degrees you want, which is theirs. And so that was kind of their means of exploiting the Masonic system, so they could put in their high degree system on top of these symbolic degrees.
But that's not unusual, really, in the world of European Masonry, is it?
Sure. I mean, I'm just saying that it
is for us, but
it's interesting, and I really think it's kind of a fascinating little thing, because no one's really thought much about that. Well, hey, maybe in point of fact, maybe their craft degrees carried on until 1933, but it's not within an Illuminati context. It's just a symbolic degree system, and the high degree system they tried to transplant early on dies off, and so it's just kind of operating on its own.
So talk a little bit about the philosophy of the degree system.
Well, that's really interesting. So Weishaupt, he loves philosophy, and so his parents die when he's young, and he kind of is raised by his godfather, the Baron von Ickstadt, who's also a faculty member like his father at Ingolstadt University. He's the book censor, so all the books you're not supposed to read. Weishaupt grows up reading all these things, and so he's really heavy into Rousseau, a guy named Bonnet. In one of the lectures in the priest degree, it's called A Lesson in the First Chamber, they talk about Rousseau's discourse on the origin of human inequality, which later becomes, what is that thing? The social contract. So and so basically the overarching idea is that man's born into absolute freedom because all he needs to do is provide for him and himself. But through his needs and the needs of society, as things progress, he's enslaved by these things. And so the idea is to attain maximum personal liberty, is to do away with all the unnecessary things in life. And that's a means of obtaining your freedom. So that's loosely the idea of that one. In his Docetist degree, through logical secular reasoning, he tries to prove the existence of the soul and the immortality of God, or no, the immortality of the soul and the existence of God through logical secular reasoning, which is wild. I mean, he uses a lot of philosophically unsound arguments, but his language is so florid that it sounds really nice.
It sounds almost theosophical.
In a way, yes, but it's got a real rationalist kind of base to it. So there's no mystical things in it at all, really. But it's really interesting because his wife dies, and he's more of a materialist to begin with, and so he writes it, and he's trying to rationalize these things out. Interestingly enough, as he's writing these things down, and after the Illuminati dies out, he starts publishing a lot of the content of these rituals in philosophical works. So he's continuing his legacy, but he does it under the auspices of philosophy, probably where it properly belonged in the first place.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So as this thing started to really Rise, the government didn't like it so much, huh?
Well, it's interesting.
How'd they get in trouble?
Well, so Karl Theodor, like the first thing he does when he comes into power, he trades like the western half of Bavaria, gives it to Austria, and gives a nice little title for it. But he doesn't really care too much about Bavaria. He wants to get, like in the Netherlands, he wants to trade all of Bavaria to Austria to go get his crown in the Netherlands, is what he's looking to do. He gets caught up in this scandal, and he's looking for a nice, convenient distraction. Well, meanwhile, the Illuminati, they're moving along at a pretty good clip at this point. We're talking like 1785, and some of these members are starting to defect, and they're saying, they're doing bad things, and so it's convenient. So what he does is he basically starts putting these edicts out that says that, secret societies can't exist anymore. And the next edict is like the Illuminati themselves, and by the third edict, like in 87, if you're a member of the Illuminati, it's the death sentence, and that pretty much does them in. But it only does them in Bavaria, and they operate like in the northern states until like 1788. But so what it is they do a series of raids on like some of the leading figures in the Illuminati, and they seize their papers. And it's kind of like if I got into your email account, I bet in like 10 or 15 minutes I could, just doing some keyword searching, I could find stuff and present it in such a way to make you look, in a bad light. And that's what they did to them.
Wouldn't take that long for me.
Yeah. Okay, maybe 2 minutes then. Okay. But that's the idea, is that they kind of cherry pick this information out and they make them look bad. Because, if you think about it, we all do good, we all do bad. So if you're trying to really make someone look bad, anyone's blackmailable is the idea. And that's what they did.
Right. So then there they were. They were done.
That's it.
But you can't kill an idea, can you?
No, you can't.
All right. So you talked about the guy that came over that was the Rite of Strict Observance guy. What was his name?
Baron von Hund.
Oh, no. Yeah. So. Oh. And then after he died, the other guy.
Adolf von Knigge.
I can't even say that. Let alone spell.
Knigge.
All right. So, what is the Rite of Strict Observance?
So the Rite of Strict Observance, it's basically a system of degrees where they're saying that Freemasonry comes from the Knights Templar, so they have like the symbolic degrees, and they have 3 degrees on top of that. It's really interesting because they take like the whole German Scots Master tradition, and then they add on the knighting ceremony on top of that. And then once you hit that degree, like you move on to these 2 administrative degrees. So you stop being a Freemason. It's more like administrative thing for the government. But for all intents and purposes, it's kind of like preserving the Templar legend, which doesn't exist. And what's interesting is Alain Bernheim in his it was like 1995 Volume 2 Herodom article, he wrote a thing called the Avatars of the Knights Kadosh. He kind of makes a point there that's real salient, where he talks that probably von Hund is initiated into this system, the Sublime Elected Knights, but he doesn't have the rituals for it. And so what he's probably doing is creating this system based on this system, which actually has links to what later becomes the Knights Kadosh degree. And so that's why there's loosely like Templar connections. So it starts from a common point, but it kind of takes 2 different branches. And so
no proof that it goes back to the actual Templars.
No, there's no evidence for any of these things. It's just a nice, fancy little idea. And a lot of it goes back to the liturgy and the legend, like we were talking about it last night, to the whole Scottish Master degree. And that's where a lot of these ideas come from.
So Ramsay didn't come up with this idea?
Ramsay did not invent the idea. He's repeating the liturgy. And so now that we have, in English, but also the Germans beat us to the punch, they have the whole Ramsay's oration, but they also have the Scots Master degree. Jan Snook and those guys discovered it in close archives in the Netherlands. And it's really fascinating because, like, you actually read this liturgy and this legend. It doesn't say anything about the Templars. It talks about the Crusaders. And, things like kind of like telephone gets passed around, so the Crusaders become the Templars, and that's where you get the idea. And all it was just that in that whole legend, it's recovering the true Master's word is what they're after.
Right. So this Scots Master degree, what is that?
Well, it's the first high degree, if you don't count the Master Mason degree being created somewhere around 1725, maybe a little bit before. There's hints like that are earlier, but you don't have conclusive proof until 25. So I guess that's what we say these days. This ritual is created somewhere between 25 and 33. I lean towards the latter half of the 20s. The point is that it's a sanction by the Modern Grand Lodge because they allow these lodges to operate. It's sanctioned by them, and they don't have a problem with it at all. And it's just another like a high degree system. So it's instead of the substitute word, they're after the actual original Master's word, and that's what they're kind of chiefly set about. And so in continental Europe is like when the Scots Master degree, you get all these different like early high degrees, and they're like little local variations of the same thing. And that's why they all tell the same story, but the storyline's a little bit different, words a little bit different, and the rituals are kind of augmented. And that's what's happening. It's like in the 40s and 50s, it really takes off.
So, what's the chart that the Grand Lodge of England had that showed all the lodges? I saw you use this in a program one time that had the Scots Master degree.
That's right. And so there's...
So they're obviously sanctioned.
Yeah, so Picart's, I forget the full technical name, but it's like his little list of lodges, and there's 4 lodges on there that are unique, and 3 of them are what they call a Master Mason's Lodge, and then one of them says a Scots Master's Lodge. And if you go and look at them, all 4 of these lodges are without charters. And so what it is by dispensation, they're allowed to confer these degrees. And so this thing is like constructed, it was like a 30 engraving? Or no, it's 33. It's a 33 engraving. And so what you're seeing is from 25 to 33, we're only talking about, 8 years of time. And so the Master Mason ritual isn't like conferred in a lot of these lodges yet, and so they have special lodges for dispensation, but by like 35 they're all wiped off the rolls because they're all practicing the Master Mason degree. And so that's really like the earliest evidence we have for Scots Master. And
it travels. Mm-hmm. It goes all over Europe, right?
That's right. So in Berlin, like in 1742, this lodge L'Union, they have Scots Master Lodge that's set up, and if you actually read in that actual book, it says that they're chartered from London from the French Union Lodge. And so what it means is they're working in French, so this ritual is translated into French in London and exported in 42, and they're the mother lodge that kind of spreads throughout Germany. A Scots Master probably comes to France about 1740, and so what you're seeing is like in London, they're like kind of transplanting this new high degree, but as it becomes local, they start adding on degrees, especially in France. Like really a lot of the high degrees explode in France. But it's interesting because L'Union, like in 43, it's mentioned in their minute book that they add the whole Night of St. Andrew ceremony on top of it. And so there's like this tradition, like in the German high degrees, where you have Scots Master and Scottish Knight. In point of fact, it was just an additional ceremony they added on, but you can see how these things start growing. So by 43, it's already starting to grow and evolve in Germany too.
Yeah, I think as American Freemasons, I know it took me a while to wrap my mind around the fact that the ritual is so static these days, and it's so controlled by the ritual police, and the relationships between the Scottish Rite, the York Rite, and the Blue Lodge is so fixed that we just think it's always been that way. I can't tell you how many times I've heard a guy say, well, it's been that way from time immemorial. Well, of course it hasn't. And even today, the European systems work different Blue Lodge degrees. You go to some of the people that we don't necessarily recognize, but even some of the ones that we do recognize, they work different rituals. I mean, even in Scotland, it's the same ritual, but it's the same storyline, but it's different in every lodge that you go to. They don't do
standardization.
They don't do. They don't have ritual police that are checking every thou and thee and making sure that you got it right. We're just so not used to that in America. It confuses people when they go to talk about all these different rites, and they're like, "Oh, well, that's something different and old. That's something different and old." But it's the way that most of the Masonic world works. Yes.
That's what's interesting about it too is like America is like its own unique little thing, and it's kind of not a bad thing necessarily, but it's a distinction, right? So if you look at like Masonic ritual, like the one constant theme is that it's always changing, it's always evolving, even from like its earliest days. There's a bunch of like really interesting projects going on right now. They've got like copies of stuff that go back to like 1659, right? And then it's just interesting because like, it stays the same for a while, it changes. It stays the same for a while, it changes. And so like a lot of the American ritual, like if you go read Three Distinct Knocks, I mean, that's the American form of rituals, more ancient system. So if you wanted to say time immemorial, well, how immemorial? I mean, maybe are we talking 1751? Or are we because the moderns are before those guys, but yet American Masonry for the most part is loosely based on modern or ancients ritual, and then you have the whole Preston Webb and Cross and all these different things for lectures and so forth that kind of expand out. So, I mean, I think embracing like all different ideas and these things like that, there's value in it, and there's also value in studying the evolution of these things. At least there is to me, but
Right. We just got to be I think we've got to be careful. We teach a program on allegory and symbolism here in North Carolina, and we talk about the positions of the officers and what those positions mean and stuff. But we were talking last night. They haven't always sat in those positions.
That's right.
Today in like Pennsylvania ritual, and certainly in emulation and stuff, they have different officers that we don't even have, and they sit in different positions and they say different things. So you got to be careful. We always try to preface our talks by the fact that nobody is a custodian of universal truth.
That's right.
Everybody, just be careful. We're going to tell you some examples of what these things in the lodge could mean to you, but do your own research.
Sure.
And figure out what it means to you. So you got to be wary of people that say this thing absolutely means this and nothing else.
Well, it's fascinating too, because if you look at like the French form of Freemasonry, although we don't recognize them as regular, if you look at the position of their officers, I mean, they're actually the oldest form, because in the original English Masonic rituals, both wardens are in the West. And so although we don't recognize them as regular, a lot of the stuff that they do is preserving the oldest traditions of Freemasonry, which is kind of ironic, isn't it?
Absolutely. All right, so a couple of rabbit holes I want to chase. While we're on the Scots Master degree, let's so we talked about it in the Grand Lodge of England, and then we talked about it migrating to the continent. Talk about the evolution of that and how we see it today.
Well, I mean, for a long time, we didn't even know what the Scots Master degree was, and people thought that it was lost, it was missing, we'd never find it. Well, the truth is like, you probably shouldn't make like absolute statements, because it's not really true, especially if you haven't done the research on it. And so, thanks to our German brethren, they've, dredged this degree out of the ether, and it turns out that, it was never really lost at all. It was the parfait degree the whole time. And so, and if you look at the parfait degree, not the total one we practice today, but like the earliest fragments of the parfait degree that we can see like in the 40s and the 50s, they called it parfait in France, but that was the Scots Master is what they called it. And it's interesting because you start looking at these things in these early forms of degree, and you start seeing a whole lot of connection and synchronicity with the Royal Arch degree. And then there's also a transitional degree between from Scots Master to the Royal Arch. There's a transitional degree that happens also, and you start seeing even more of the elements. And so what we're seeing is basically the whole Jacobite uprising and so forth. It's no longer popular to be a Scottish Freemason, but you can be a Royal Arch Mason. That's okay. So it's like a rebranding. What's going on.
And does it come all the way down? Does it eventually morph into what we see in the Scottish Rite today? Obviously, these are some familiar names to Scottish Rite Masons.
Yeah, and so like what it is like we were talking about, maybe degrees 4 through 14 in our present system, they're like local variations of Scots Master. If you go back to their earliest copies and you kind of follow their evolution, what you see is that they're all loosely telling the same story. Maybe not the Elu degrees; they're kind of dealing with the ruffians in those, but for the most part, a lot of these early degrees are like evolutionary things of Scots Master, and that's. People maybe would want their own vanity or so forth, so you're going to make, we're the Irish Masters, we're the English Masters. And so what you start seeing is these things coming out of that same source.
Going backwards in time from when you see them listed with the Grand Lodge of England, do you know where they came from prior to that?
What do you mean?
The Scots Master degree, before the 1730s. Where do you think it came from?
Well, it's fragmentary, but it's probably just like so that if you look in the early Scots Master degree, it looks like it's more of like an alternate Master Mason ritual is what it looks like. So it could be a local variation of Master Mason, but who did it and when it was constructed, we don't know that yet. I'm not saying the information's not out there, I just haven't got to it yet. But it's on the list.
Do you think if you had to make a guess, would you tie it more, its evolution coming from a Stuart dynasty kind of perspective or a Scotland kind of perspective, Scotland as a nation kind of perspective, or something different?
I think it's something different. Because if you look at it, the early modern Grand Lodge, it was more like a Hanoverian type thing where you have the new
former king's men.
Yeah. Like the obligations are you'll be a true liegeman to the king and so forth. And so it doesn't make sense that they would be fostering quote unquote Scottish things there, but it's an allusion to Scotland having the oldest operative Masonic lodges before it's a gentleman's club. So it's they're paying an homage to it. But what's interesting is when this degree is transplanted into France, it's picked up by the Stuarts and so forth. And it's not that they're using it per se, but so it starts off more of like an alternate Master Mason thing, but it takes a different form when it's in France, is what's going on.
And by this time, the Stuarts are again in exile in France, trying to make a comeback.
They're going to try.
Which ends poorly, of course.
Yeah, it doesn't go so well.
Very interesting. All right, so let's go back down another rabbit hole that we visited a minute ago and didn't quite get down, was the Rite of Strict Observance. Those guys still around?
Well, there's groups that are kind of operating like them, but remember we were talking like that they went away and it kind of spurred on different little systems. So like, Knigge goes off and he tries to do his Illuminati high degree system, which loosely a reform of the strict observance rituals. Then you've got Jean-Baptiste Villemos, and who does like the CBCS, and then the rectified Scottish Rite. That's also another reform. Then you've got like the Zinzendorf Rite. That's another reform, which later goes on to become the Swedish Rite. The most beautiful Masonic system I've ever seen is the Swedish Rite, and they're loosely like, it's kind of like the strict observance never died, but they've gone a different direction with it. But it's still, that's what it's basically based on, and it comes from the Zinzendorf Rite, which is a reform of the strict observance. And so there's groups in France today that are operating as the strict observance, and maybe they're regular, maybe they're not, but they're not like a direct connection to it. They are using the right rituals, but it's like they're like paying an homage to like an older group.
I thought I heard a rumor or read somewhere that the Rite of Strict Observance merged with what's now the CBCS, the Scottish Rectified Rite, and this, which is kind of the CBCS.
And that's what we were talking about. Like
tell them what the Scottish Rectified Rite and CBCS is.
So basically, it's they remove like the whole like Templar legend thing. So like you have the Congress of Wilhelmsbad, 1782, and that's where like they do the death blow to the strict observance. And so I've got a nice thing of like all these printed reform rituals and tracing boards that I found in an archive over in Europe. And it basically like lists all the rituals out, and so they're taking all these things. They change degree titles. They remove all the Templar liturgy, and so they're no longer the Knights Templar. They're the Beneficent Knights of the Holy City. But it's the same thing. It's just a little rebranding.
Did Willermans go to the Rite of Strict Observance and have a meeting with them and say, "Hey, let's merge up with Elu Cohen stuff, maybe"?
I've heard these stories, but I haven't fleshed them out, to be honest. But so he attends Congress of Wilhelmsbad, and he kind of has the upper hand because the Illuminati are competing for influence. There's also Golden Rosy Cross people competing for influence. But ultimately, the final outcome is that the strict observance is gone, and everyone kind of runs their own directions and starts making their own reforms. But
wouldn't you like to have been a fly on the wall at that meeting?
Well, Reinhard's been working on it for. What university is he doing stuff with? It's down in Austria, but he's working on this, and he's transcribed and gone through all like the correspondence records. I've got a bunch of it, but he's really done like the lion's share of work. He's a much better scholar than me.
What are you saying? There's a book coming out on this?
Yeah, it'll be in German though, so study hard.
Well, you'll be able to translate it in like 2 or 3 days, won't you?
Maybe take a month, but. But it would be really interesting.
So where does all this information come from?
Well,
do they keep minutes?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And then there's these several strict observance conventions. There's one in Colo in 1772. So there's all these different little conventions they would have, and it's the participants. And so if you want to know what happened there, different people are taking notes, and so you go and find these guys' notes that are in archives. Some of them are in private family archives, but you go through and you look at all these different things, and so it's basically you have to take all these perspectives and compile them into a authentic record.
So these meetings that you're talking about, if I understand, if we're on the same page here, they would be like a consortium of secret societies that all come together and talk about their stuff.
So that's the Congress of Wilhelmsbad. So there you see a lot of like cross membership in these groups. So specifically, its focus is strict observance. But I'm also in this other group. So while we're here. But like the early stuff up, before 82, it's strictly like strict observance people. Yes, they have other groups that are meeting in, but the purpose is administrative for the strict observance.
Yeah, I'd love to have been there.
Yeah, the golden age.
Well, we'll be looking for that book. You be sure and let us know when that comes out. All right, let's circle back and talk a little bit about World War II and European records and Sweden's role in that. Just tell that whole story that you were telling last night.
Yeah, so it's really fascinating because there's several Masonic archives out there that are really important. Copenhagen's important. Close archives in The Hague is very important. I think the most important one though is up there in Stockholm. And I was there in their archives back in 2016, kind of playing around after I got done talking in Oslo, and I was going through a lot of the stuff. I mean, it's an absolute gold mine. I mean, and what's funny is the Swedish Freemasons don't really seem to care too much about it. They care about the Swedish Rite, but I mean, I don't even know how much. I mean, I did like 3,000 images in 5 days of pages of manuscripts that I wanted. I didn't even touch like maybe 5% of it.
So what would happen in World War II, if I understand this right, is as Germany would invade a country, they didn't like the Freemasons, so they would go to the Freemasons' Grand Lodge Hall and say, "Give us all your records," and they would put them in a boxcar, Indiana Jones style, and send them back to Germany in some big ass warehouse. Is that right?
Next to the Ark of the Covenant.
Yes, next to the Ark of the Covenant. And so those archives are lost from all the European Grand Lodges at that time, with a few exceptions.
Yeah.
Sweden being one.
Yes,
and the
one in Denmark and Copenhagen. So Copenhagen builds a false wall and hides their archives behind it. Sweden makes a deal with the Germans.
I can't believe that worked. The Germans were pretty smart.
They didn't knock hard enough.
Yes.
It's funny though. There's also like German lodges that were in Germany that were sending their papers and stuff to Sweden also to be stored up there, so that people got wise. And so there's a complete like German lodge records going all the way through the 18th century up until like the early part of the 19th century, where they send their collections up there. There's only a handful of examples that I know of.
Because Sweden was neutral.
That's right.
That's what you said.
Yeah, and so they basically would let the Germans cross through to beat up on Finland, and that was the idea.
Yeah.
And but it's crazy because like so the on the surface, like they had to rough a couple lodges up front and seize their records. And after that, everyone's like, oh no, here, take them, here you go, no big deal. But the entire history of like continental Freemasonry, for the most part, like after the Germans come into play, it's off records until like all that stuff is after the fall of the Soviet Union, because the Soviets captured all these things. So we're in a renaissance right now of this kind of research.
Right, so just to slow down a minute. So not only were the Germans taking over countries and seizing them, I guess the Russians were taking over the Eastern European countries and seizing theirs. And then when Berlin fell, or I don't know where those records were exactly kept, but then the Russians got them all.
Yeah, so
the Russians are the ones that wound up with them.
So the German division, like, was this thing of the SS called the RSHA, and they're studying for this alleged, Jewish plot in Freemasonry and so forth, which of course they don't find. And they seize all these records, and at the end of the war, along with some of the final solution papers, they're stored in this cave in like Silesia, which is today like Poland, and the Soviets captured. So the Soviets don't close down lodges, that's all the Germans, but all these massive archives, looted treasures and that kind of stuff, they grab all that stuff, take it back to Moscow, and of course they study it too, but they do it from a different perspective. And they see it as like this capitalist undermining force, and or at least that's what they say on paper, but really it's just cool to read old stuff. Secrets.
Probably, so that's where most of that stuff is. Still, today, what hadn't been sold off by the oligarchy? Can you find this stuff on the dark web?
No. Are
you sure?
Well, there's some things you can find, but most of it was given back in between 91 and 93. They still have some stuff in Minsk, like we were talking about, and there's probably some other things that are out there too that I don't even know about. And until we do the right research, you're just not going to know. So
they're sending this stuff back to like the Grand Lodge, but you had told me on a previous conversation that sometimes they're sending it back to the wrong place. Some countries have multiple Grand Lodges,
yeah,
and they don't know who to send it to. And sometimes you said, like, if it says Scotch Master, they think it goes to Scotland. Yes?
That's right.
And many variations of that. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so there's, remember that Lodge L'Union? So the Grand Orient of France gets that minute book for it, and they get that minute book for that Scots Master Lodge over there. But the trouble is that it probably should have gone back to Germany because that's where it belonged. And what's interesting is Reinhard recently found the second minute book. So they have more of their records in Berlin. So if a lodge doesn't exist anymore, it would go, like in Germany, it would go to the Secret State Archives in Berlin. And so they have like a massive collection. That's where the Illuminati papers are at too. And so stuff went there, stuff went to the Grand Orient, stuff went back to Scotland, Grand Lodge of England, not so much.
I wonder how that worked. I wonder if some archivist in Russia gets on the phone and calls up, the Grand Lodge of, Portugal and says, "Hey, I got something I think might be yours. Y'all want it? I don't know, what is it?" And it's this thing, and you got to pay the shipping. I mean, how does that work?
Well, prior to the fall of the Soviet Union, there was researchers that were already going to Moscow and researching through these papers. So that they, even as late as like the 80s, they kind of knew what was going on loosely, like individual researchers. And there's a lady whose name escapes me. Like, she started listing out all these collections that were there, and that's when the idea got going. And so these different people started writing back and forth because they want their original records back. And so, I mean, through various and circuitous routes, that's how they get an idea of what's there. And not everything goes back to the right place, but that's okay. It came back.
I'm sure some of that. So there's a ton of it still there. But most of it, you say, has gone to Germany.
No, most has come back.
To Germany.
No, most of it's come back. So like the German stuff that's totally in the German language, the Germans get. French stuff goes to the Grand Orient.
So they're just doing it more by language than anything.
That's the sorting method.
That makes sense.
Yeah, because the thing about it, the Lunyon Minute book's all in French, and they're like, oh, it's
I wonder who's paying for it to ship it.
I think the Grand Lodges have to be honest.
It'd be worth it. Certainly.
I would, yeah. It's like, do you want everything that goes back to the 1740s? No, it's just really expensive. Can't afford the shipping.
Well, I certainly hope that the Grand Lodges that are getting this stuff have serious historical, academic archivists that are really sorting through it and trying to.
Yes, they do.
Because here in the States, our guys would be overwhelmed and probably not, just throw it on a dusty old shelf and
let it mold to nothing.
Yeah, probably. I mean, not all of them. I'm sure some do better than others, but we've all seen it. We've seen examples of there's stuff sitting in Grand Lodges that should be absolute treasures that are sitting on a dusty old shelf.
Well, I was up in New York recently. I guess it was a year or two ago. But anyways, I was hanging out and I was kind of playing around. I was like, "Oh, hey, Kofi, what's these up here?" And I pulled it out. I was like, "Oh, just a minute book from 1860, whatever." Oh, yep, this is an entire financial ledger. And it's just things that are just loosely scattered about. And I mean, this, if you think about it, it's our history. I mean, at the very least, we owe the dignity and respect to our former brothers to preserve this stuff, don't we?
Amen. We're lucky here in North Carolina. We have Jonathan now, who's the assistant grand secretary, but his history is in museum and in history. That's what his major is. And so he's really going through all our stuff and trying to catalog it and put it in some semblance of use. But before that, there were good guys. It just wasn't a priority to them that were in charge of that kind of stuff. And it was just piled up on shelves. And there's all these fabulous, what we consider fabulous treasures that, we didn't even know we had. And I'm sure that tons of states are like that. And I hope that Europe is not like that.
No.
I hope they have the foresight to say this is real gold here.
Well, I'd like to see more in the U.S. too, where you study Freemasonry, even to non-Masons, academics study it as the origin of Western democracy. That's the approach that happens in Europe. It was going on in UCLA until Margaret Jacobs retired recently. Our universities really need to consider doing this, even for just pure academics. It makes a lot of sense because when you start looking at the famous Scottish historian Niall Ferguson?
No.
Okay, well he's in California now, I think at Stanford, and he's written a lot of books. Reinhard and I contributed to a little part to his book, The Square and the Tower, and his whole kind of thesis in this book is that historians too much have paid attention to hierarchies and not enough to networks. Right, so the networks of people, who do these people touch, and how does that influence things? And what you'll find is history isn't like a linear hierarchical structure. You have these overlapping relationships go to these relationships. If you study history from that approach, you can actually figure things out. And so from that same perspective applied to democracy, if we did that with Freemasonry and the Masonic networks, you might have a different perspective of history.
Yeah, Revolutionary Brotherhood kind of comes at it from that angle.
Yeah, exactly.
We need more of that. In Oklahoma, they were telling me that they fund an academic chair at their Grand Lodge. I think it was their Grand Lodge. Maybe it was their Scottish Rite. Funds an academic chair. I think it's OSU, but one of the universities out there. We would probably make better inroads to getting that kind of academic research done if we would throw some dollars at them. But we're so short-sighted these days. This whole T.O. Lodge concept and a kind of a deeper, more philosophical look at the craft is a wave that's just starting to go. So maybe in 30 or 40 years, the craft will find itself at a place where it's again interested in that kind of stuff and can throw some dollars their way. Starting again, they're doing it in Oklahoma. Maybe that'll grow. Right now we're we're into pancakes and whatnot. But
Fish fries,
but
you know.
it's changing. I can feel a change coming there. So maybe we'll get there one day, because we think of Masonic history. We think we're so late coming to the game that the stuff that is that are our archives here in America aren't really that important, but they will be a couple hundred years from now.
I would beg to differ on that one. There's things in American archives that are absolute treasures. I mean, just freaking priceless. I mean,
Right. Well, again, in North Carolina, we have just in the last, since Jonathan has taken over, started trying to get all the records from the older lodges that are sitting in their filing cabinets and getting those digitized
Yes.
and preserved. And they'll either take the actual records to the Grand Lodge, or the University of North Carolina has a Southern Historical Collection where they'll archive them in their properly climate controlled archives, or they'll let the lodges keep them. They'll just digitize them, and so that they're available that way. But until then, those things were sitting down. They're susceptible to fire and flood and theft and whatever else. And,
I'd like to see an initiative like where the Grand Lodge, we got like a rig that we're going to take with us to Sweden here coming up, and basically it's like an overhead scanner, and you can lay like full books that are bound, right, and as fast as you can turn the page, this thing's snapping 600 DPI pictures as fast as you can go.
Yeah.
And it's like between $500 used, $1,000 new for one of these Fujitsu SnapScan SV600s. You get one of these things and you set it loose in an archive. I mean, you will absolutely get everything as fast as possible, high res. If a Grand Lodge would invest in something like that and have like an initiative to go through and start preserving all these old records.
You're saying $1,000 you can get it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's nothing.
That's what I'm saying. And so, the excuse is, oh, we don't have the money for that. We have to send it someplace. No, you don't. Oh, this book's been damaged by mold. It's going to mess up my scanner. No, it's not. It doesn't even touch it. It's contactless. And so, I mean, I've got different ideas for solutions in this stuff, but I think if the Grand Lodges will seriously consider preserving their history, not just because it's the right thing to do, but they also owe it to their former brothers. So these are their memories. This was their experience. This was their time. And it's also, look at genealogically, right? There's all this value here. And if we'll just go through and as fast as you can turn the pages for $1,000 outlay, you can make this work.
500 years from now, it'll be super important.
Exactly.
Don't we wish we had them around 500 years ago?
Please. Yeah, back then, that's why you got all these manuscripts. You had to copy by hand.
Okay, so we pretty much talked about Sweden already and World War II and all that stuff coming back. Let's talk about what you're going to talk about tomorrow. What's your program on? Or today? That's today.
It is today, yeah.
Ooh, in a little bit.
More coffee, please. Now, so the first one I'm doing is on the Illuminati. So I'm kind of giving my standard Illuminati presentation. I don't think I'm going to do it much more. So I think at some point I'm going to take it and convert it into like a little presentation and put it on the web, so that way I don't have to give it anymore.
Right.
But the other one I'm doing was my paper. This last was it February, March? I can't remember. I was inducted into the Blue Friars. And so I read it.
What are the Blue Friars?
Oh, Blue Friars is a group of it's kind of like an honorarium. I think I'm number 108 since like the 30s when it was created, and it's for Masonic scholars and authors and that kind of thing.
Congratulations.
Well, thanks, brother. I
Quite
appreciate
quite
it.
an honor.
Yeah, I mean, I was totally shocked, to be honest. The paper I read for it, and I'm going to read this one also for you guys later today, is Marin and the Balo Manuscript.
Tell us about it.
Well, the Balo manuscript, without giving everything away on it, it has a lot to do with the early origins of the Scottish Rite. And this paper kind of establishes all
I
sorts.
thought Albert Pike invented the Scottish Rite.
Well, unfortunately, he improved the Scottish Rite. And so, long story short, Marin, he's the founder of this system. Balo has a whole lot to do with him. And it has a whole lot to do with the Franken manuscripts too. It's probably the source text for it. I think I can conclusively prove that, but that's coming down the road. We'll go into that one a little bit more later. But the important thing is the Marin's place. I mean, so I basically lay out in this presentation his connection to Balo, why I think it's related to him. The sphere of his influence in Saint-Domingue, how the system came up, how he even got to be involved into the high degrees, and it's all new, unpublished research. No one's ever done this kind of stuff. Is kind of what I like to do, because if you look at if economics is the study of scarcity, information that's rare is valuable, and that's kind of my approach to history. So I go after rare, exotic stuff.
So if the embryonic Scottish Rite degrees were coming through that part of the world. They were coming from the continent.
Yeah.
France.
Yeah.
Yep. And then they were making their way down into the Caribbean.
That's right.
And then they made their way to America. Where first? Tell us about Franken.
Okay, well, so Franken, he's a former Dutch citizen, comes into Jamaica, works for the crown. He does, various things throughout his career. But he comes into contact with Marin probably the first time in like late 1762, and then Marin goes back in 65. And, that's probably where they start working on this idea for their system. And so what Marin has authorization from, without giving it all away, like he's got authorization from the Grand Lodge of France and the Grand Lodge of England to confer this system. Well, he kind of loses his powers in Saint-Domingue, which is under the French Grand Lodge at this point. And so that's what he's going over to Jamaica to do, and also to kind of pass the torch, because he's an old man at this point, and he's trying to keep his system that he's invented going. And so Franken kind of takes over. And he transplants it to Albany in '67. What's funny is, like, he goes up to New York to get married to a nice Dutch girl, but while he's there, I'm just going to go ahead and start this high degree system too. And so he starts the Albany Lodge of Perfection, and then during the Revolution it goes dark, and then it comes back up in Philadelphia, and then kind of up and down the Eastern Seaboard, then Charleston, and I think we all know where the rest of the history goes.
So no, just go ahead and keep on that line. So you're saying that the Scottish Rite started in Albany, as we know it, the incipient phase.
If you want to go,
I think that would drive some of my Southern jurisdiction brothers out of their mind that don't know that. But
I mean, if we're following Marin's career, it really goes back to 1745 in France, from agreement from England into Bordeaux to start up, their little lodge over there. And it kind of expands out. And then Marin, he's a merchant. He's bringing finished goods to Saint-Domingue and bringing raw materials back. And so using his kind of merchant thing, he takes that system. He's got proconsul powers from that little group out of Bordeaux. He loses those powers, and then when their Grand Lodge collapses, he goes back, gets powers again, goes back, loses them again, and then goes back over to the Caribbean. So, if you want to get real technical about it, it goes back to France, but the system itself, the Order of the Royal Secret, really goes Jamaica and is transplanted into Albany. So it's France, Saint-Domingue, Jamaica, Albany, Philadelphia, up and down the Eastern Seaboard, Charleston, and then the Scottish Rite happens.
Right. So then in Charleston, the guys that we start to know grab hold of it, and Pike rewrites them. Yes?
Like in the 1850s.
Yeah, and then it starts to take a form that we're more familiar with.
That's right.
When you read the older stuff before Pike got a hold of it, is it recognizable? Would a guy recognize it as a degree that we work today?
Yes and no. The it's kind of like
in the southern jurisdiction.
That's right, in the southern jurisdiction. The bones are the same, but Pike kind of goes off and embellishes quite a bit, like the lectures, the philosophy. What did he say? He's he found it in a log cabin and turned it into a palace or something.
If I handed you a random degree from prior to Pike and you read it, you could probably say, "Oh, this is the."
No, I'd know it right off the bat, but and probably a lot of people.
Your average guy would pick up on
average
what
guy
it
could
is.
recognize it. Yeah, I mean, so it really the stuff pre-Pike is the Order of the Royal Secret degrees is what it is. I mean, so you have the Order of Royal Secret, then the Scottish Rite happens in 1801. So if you read these rituals, they're really close to the same. That things start augmenting in the early 1820s. They change a little bit more, and then Pike takes the system and just makes it fantastic. Not that it wasn't fantastic before, but the philosophy he puts into it makes it fantastic.
And you can get a copy of this, of the Franken.
Yeah, so there's the one
a really nice copy for a reasonable price.
Yeah, so you can get the one that the Northern jurisdiction put out. I'm partial to the one that Art did, Freemasonry's Royal Secret, because that one's they call it the Jamaica Manuscript, and it's probably a late 1790s copy. And what was the sad story on that one? They sent it off for digitization and it was stolen.
What?
Yeah, it's missing. We have scans of the manuscript, so that exists. But with the original manuscript, they sent it off to get some binding work done on it, and it just disappeared.
I'm hoping somebody's insurance got paid for that one.
I think Art wrote about it in the introduction for the book, and yeah, I'd like to find that guy.
That's sketchy. Was it in the States?
Yeah, it was in the States. They sent it off to get some binding work done. I forget. It says in the introduction, so go back and look at it. But
wonder what the value was on it.
It's priceless in my book, but I don't know, maybe $30,000 to $100,000, somewhere in there.
Should put all that money back into research.
I think so.
Pay for you to go to Sweden several times, wouldn't it?
Well, there's also good archives I want to see in France and Germany, and then some like the Eastern European places. I want to see those too.
Hey, back to Franken though. A guy can get a copy. I should have brought that book in here. You can get either Art's copy. You can get from the Scottish Rite Research Society if you go to the Southern Jurisdiction.
ScottishRite.org and take a look there.
And they have a store.
Yeah.
They have an e-store, and they have books on there that you can buy. And so I'm sure you can buy that one, or you can join the Scottish Rite Research Society for $75 a year or something.
You want to join?
$65.
You want to join the Scottish Rite Research Society. Yep. You want to buy all the books there. This is a shameless plug, of course.
Oh, absolutely. Plug away.
Okay, but also if that Northern Jurisdiction book is really interesting because it's a photo facsimile with really nice transcription work. I mean, it's really nice too, and there might be Southern Jurisdictions, Scottish Rite Research Society might have some similar things coming.
Very good. Yeah, so for anybody that doesn't know, though, if you join the Scottish Rite Research Society, it's less than $100 a year. You get that year's Heardom, which is a yearly publication of academic works, and it's really good.
Really good.
And you get a bonus book every year as long as you're paid up on time. And the bonus book is always some good academic historical research thing. So, yes, by all means, please join that. The book... the bonus book is smaller. I mean, it's kind of this size. The material is good. The Northern Jurisdiction is a great big book. It's purple and it's big and it's really nice and I want to say I paid $75 for that, maybe 85.
I think it was 85.
Yeah, so you can get that from their website. I'm sure. I guess that's where I got it from. How do you feel about the Northern Jurisdiction reworking all their degrees? What's your feeling on that?
Without
all the Southern Jurisdiction guys think it's sacrilege, and all the Northern Jurisdiction guys, that I talk to, pretty much do too. But there's some guys that think that they've kept the spirit of the lessons.
Well, I don't want to speak ill of our brothers, but I mean, if you want to look at just from like a technical standpoint, right? The stuff that goes back to like Franken. That tradition's preserved in the Southern Jurisdiction, and that, they did away with the camps and things like that. And that's funny, as I read something one time, like they were talking about, these degrees don't really mean much of anything, it's just vanity, while then they go and modify the ritual. So I was like, that kind of destroys the ethos of your argument, but that's just my opinion. But if you look at like the nuts and bolts of it, like what make the, Franken manuscripts and later makes the Scottish Rite, if you do away with all those things, is it even the Scottish Rite? I'm not saying they're not the Scottish Rite. I'm just saying they've departed from like the foundation, for good or bad. Some people think that's a good idea. Some people think it's a bad idea. Myself personally, I'm kind of like a purist, but that's just me.
Yeah, I am too. But I don't so much have a problem with them rewriting the lessons into more modern, understandable, parlance and allegory. My problem is if you're going to do that, you better dang sure understand the lesson that they're trying to tell so that you can capture that lesson. And I don't know, maybe they got great guys doing it. Maybe they absolutely captured the essence of each degree in these completely new degrees they've got. But I wonder because being an esoteric and philosophical kind of guy, if you're not into that world, you can easily miss a nuance in something that's really important that doesn't look important, that we never really explain. If you drop that out, then you've lost that lesson forever. And that's my concern with those guys. Although, just to complain about the Southern Jurisdiction for a minute.
Okay.
And I understand that Pike never intended for the degrees to be acted out as plays. I understand that's a later invention. But man, they have stripped out some really good stuff out of the ritual because they don't want to scare people. Rack scenes and chambers of reflection and stuff. We seem to be stripping all that stuff out for the reason of not wanting to be spooky. But when you participate in the degrees, man, the things that capture your attention and that you remember 10 years later, that lesson that was really imparted to you, are the things where there's something dramatic going on, or where there's something really spiritual going on, or some really special part, not just some dude droning on in the 5th minute of a 10-minute lecture about, some attribute that you're supposed to have. I mean, which that's good stuff too, but you remember those poignant parts, and they're stripping them out. It hurts my heart that they're doing it. especially when I think they're doing it for political correctness. I don't know. Maybe they just think that those parts aren't important, but I think they are.
I would tend to agree with you. And to me, it's like, the whole initiatic experience. I mean, it doesn't have to be a static thing, right? But there's core things that need to be in there. And if you look, what's the liturgical, what's the ritualistic value of these little elements that have been removed? I think I don't know if you can make a cost-benefit analysis of this stuff like that, but it would seem to me that you're not gaining much by removing something. In fact, you may be hurting more, right?
Especially we all know that part in the first degree where you're brought to light. I mean, it's a dramatic part. We know in the third degree, that part where important things happen. Those are the things that stick with you. And if you strip that out of those two, of the first and the third, you've got a bunch of words that are really important, but you don't have that initiatic, you're right, that initiatic, what Mike Daniels would call learning tension. It's when you create a confluence of events that is supposed to imprint upon your mind a wise and serious truth, right?
Yeah.
And when you rip that stuff out of the degrees, you lose it. And it just pisses me off that the Scottish Rite is taking that stuff out, and I don't know why. I wish somebody would explain to me why they're taking it out and why it's okay to do it and why it's not important to leave it in.
Like someone like me, I probably don't have any business leading much of anything, but if I had my way, I would, make it where we kind of go back to a lot of the things that were removed, and we put a lot of these things back into it. Because if you think about it, that's it's what Supercharges is. It's the catalyzing thing. It's the actual it's not the definition of the experience like that, but it's a very important element, right? So if you went to go make a cake and you're like, well, eggs are no longer politically convenient. We don't need eggs anymore.
Right.
Well, do you have a cake? I don't know. It looks like a cake. It tastes loosely like a cake.
Right. Yes, that's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Well, when you get to be a muckety-muck up there, how about putting all that stuff back in? Matter of fact, we'll put some more stuff in like that.
I think I'm just going to stick to the research.
I don't know. Well, at least ask those guys. Ask them why they did it. I mean, I'd just be interested to know. I hope it's some reason other than we want to be politically correct. I hope it's something other than that. I hope there's some reason that they think that they can teach that in a better way without it.
I don't know the answer. And...
All right, I'm done bitching about that.
Okay, You got your grumpy past master face on.
I know. Doggone it. All right, so I think we've probably worked through most of the important things here. But if they want to know more about this stuff, they can find this book on
Amazon.com.
Right on. We're playing with so Brown, our usual tech guy, our producer, is at the beach, and so my lovely wife Darla is manning the board back there, and I saw her jump. So she's got it going on now.
Okay.
Joe, we really appreciate you coming all the way out here to North Carolina. This will be the second time I've heard you talk. I can't wait to see it. Congratulations on the Blue Friars. You're doing great work. You're going to be one of the guys in 100 years that's going to go down in Masonic infamy, I'm sure of it. So keep the faith, brother.
Oh, thank you,
keep
brother.
doing good stuff. And thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you next time. This has been a production of 357 Productions, who is glad to bring you Brother Josef Wages from Texas, Masonic scholar.
Yeehaw!